They called it worthless land, a cabin on the edge of the Rockies, sold for the price of a few copper coins. But when a penniless cowboy laid down 7 cents and claimed the deed, he found more than shelter waiting in the shadows. Behind the broken door stood a wild Mustang, black as midnight, with her trembling foals at her side. What began as chance ownership would soon draw him into a battle of blood fire and betrayal, and force him to decide whether a man with nothing left can protect a legacy meant to outlive them all. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. Elias Boone had always been poor. He came from the wide plains where cattle dust clung to the skin, and every sunrise meant another day of driving longhorns for other men's fortunes. He had slept more nights under the stars than under a roof, his bedroll smelling of sweat leather and prairie grass. The work paid little, just enough for tobacco whiskey on rare nights and oats for his horse. But it kept him alive, and in the years before the war, that had seemed enough. When the Civil War broke out, Elias traded his lariat for a saber and enlisted with the Union cavalry. He was a strong rider, knew how to track game and endure long marches in hostile country, so the army found him useful. He learned to fire a carbine from the saddle, to read the land the way a hunter reads sign, and to fight until his arms trembled from exhaustion. He survived battles where men screamed into the mud and never rose again. And he returned westward when the war finally ended, his pockets empty, his skin weathered, his heart already older than his years. But the war had left him with nothing. The little patch of land he once dreamed of owning had been seized for debts while he fought back east. The ranchers who knew his name had moved on or gone under. Work was scarce, and what remained he couldn't keep. Younger men filled the saddle's men without ghosts in their eyes. Elias wandered from ranch to ranch until even his name seemed to fade from memory. By the time he was 30, all he had left was an old horse with a swayback and a few battered belongings in a canvas sack. The worst of it had not been the war. The worst came later. In a border town where dust choked the air and the river stank of stagnation, Elias had tried to build a family. He found a woman named Clara with kind eyes and laughter that softened his edges. They had a boy just old enough to ride a pony bareback when the yellow fever swept through. Elias sold everything he owned to pay for doctors and medicine, but none of it mattered. Clara went first fever bright on her brow, whispering his name until her breath vanished. The boy followed days later, his small hand limp in Elias's grasp. Elias buried them himself on a rise above the river, marked with 2 rough-hewn crosses. He never returned to that town. From then on, he lived like a man already buried, drifting westward with no destination, eating when he could, sleeping where the land allowed. He carried their memory in silence and his guilt with every step. "If I'd been home," he muttered once to the empty night, "if I'd stayed, maybe I could have saved them." But the stars gave no answer. Years passed that way, and Elias became the sort of man others forgot at a glance. He worked for wages, drank when he had coin, and rode away before anyone asked where he was headed. A man who looked alive, yet lived as if his heart had been extinguished. One autumn afternoon, thin from travel, he rode into a small mountain town tucked at the edge of the Rockies. The place barely qualified as a settlement, a single muddy street lined with a smithy, a saloon that leaned in the wind, a general store, and a post office. Smoke drifted from a handful of chimneys. Beyond the rooftops rose the jagged teeth of the mountains, their peaks already dusted with early snow. Elias tethered his horse outside the saloon, stepped inside, and asked for whiskey. The barkeep eyed his ragged coat, poured the drink without a word. Elias downed it in a single swallow, letting the burn remind him he was still alive. That was when Samuel Hartwell approached. The man was thin as a fence rail, shoulders stooped, skin pale with age. But his eyes, sharp pale blue, carried the kind of weight that made men listen. He eased himself onto the stool beside Elias, folded his bony hands, and studied him. "You're Boone," he said. His voice was hoarse like gravel in a dry creek bed. Elias frowned. "Do I know you?" Hartwell shook his head. "You don't. But I know the kind of man you are." Elias bristled. "Do you now?" The old man leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I've a cabin up in the Rockies. Solid timbers roof tight against the snow. Piece of land with it, too. I'll sell it to you for 7 cents. Elias blinked. 7 cents? You must be joking. Land like that's worth more than a handful of copper. Hartwell's mouth curled into something between a smile and a grimace. "I'm not selling for profit. I'm selling because that ground needs someone to watch over it. Someone who knows hardship, someone who won't run." Suspicion tightened in Elias's chest. He had heard of swindles before, miners claiming fake strikes, ranchers offering deeds to nothing but sand. He studied Hartwell's face, but the old man's eyes didn't waver. "Why me?" Elias asked. Hartwell's gaze flickered with something, fear, maybe sorrow. "Because you'll understand when the time comes." He drew a folded packet from his coat, sealed with the red stamp of Denver's courthouse. "The deed is legal, notarized. No trick." Elias turned the papers in his hands. The seal was real enough. He looked back at Hartwell. "What's your game, old man? No game." Hartwell rasped. "Just a charge. Keep the cabin. Guard it. Don't let anyone take it from you." His eyes burned suddenly bright. "Promise me, Boone, by any means necessary." There was an edge of desperation there, a plea wrapped in command. Elias should have walked away. Instead, something in Hartwell's voice, something that smelled of finality, made him nod. "All right," he said slowly. 7 cents. He dropped the coins on the counter. Hartwell pushed a key into his palm, its metal cold as winter. "Then it's yours," the old man whispered. The next morning, Elias packed what little he owned, a threadbare blanket, a hunting knife, his war-worn rifle, and a small box of keepsakes from Clara and the boy. He tied it all into a sack, slung it over his horse, and rode out of town. The mountains loomed higher with every mile, ridges black with pines, slopes shining white with snow. The air thinned and grew sharp, the kind that stung the lungs, but smelled clean. Elias guided his horse along the winding track, boots creaking in the stirrups. 7 cents for a cabin, he thought. Too cheap to be honest, too strange to ignore. Wind whispered through the treetops, carrying the cry of a hawk wheeling overhead. Elias pulled his coat tighter against the chill and muttered under his breath, "Maybe Hartwell's mad. Maybe I'm madder for agreeing." But in the hollow of his chest, a faint ember stirred the fragile hope that on that mountainside, he might find a place to rest, or failing that, a quiet spot to die without anyone noticing. The trail narrowed, snowflakes drifting down. His horse snorted, ears flicking at the sound of running water somewhere below. Elias pressed on, eyes fixed on the jagged skyline. Somewhere ahead, hidden among the trees, waited the cabin Hartwell had given him for 7 cents. Elias reached the cabin just as the sun bled its last light across the ridges of the Rockies. The evening glow spread gold over the timbers, catching on the weather-worn boards and the shingles that sagged slightly beneath the weight of long winters. At first glance, the place bore the weary look of age-gray wood, faded by snow and rain corners rounded by the wind. But closer inspection told another story. The roof was tight without the yawning gaps he expected of neglect. A few boards on the walls had been replaced with newer pine, pale against the older wood. Smoke stains lingered at the mouth of the chimney, dark as soot still fresh. and the door, though it hung ajar, didn't sag on broken hinges. Someone had tended this place within the last season. Elias reined in his horse, staring at the cabin with narrowed eyes. Hartwell had sworn it was abandoned, a forgotten shell worth only the 7 cents he had paid. Yet the evidence rose in front of him: a roof still solid, repairs made by careful hands, and a hearth that had known fire not long ago. "Abandoned, is it?" Elias muttered. "Old man, what game were you playing?" He dismounted, his boots crunching against the frosted ground. The wind carried the faint smell of resin from the pines, sharp and clean. Elias led his horse to the hitching post and tied the reins loosely. The beast snorted, ears flicking nervously. That made Elias pause. The air had shifted. Something waited inside. He stepped onto the porch. The boards groaned beneath his weight, the sound loud in the mountain stillness. And then the shadows moved. From the dimness within the cabin came the shape of an animal, emerging with the grace of a storm given flesh. A Mustang mare stepped into the fading light, her coat black as coal, her mane tangled by wind, her chest broad and powerful. She filled the doorway. As if she were part of it, a sentinel set against any who dared intrude. Her eyes were what stopped him cold. They were golden bright as embers, fixed on him with unblinking intensity. She didn't rear or shriek or bare her teeth. She simply stood, her silence heavier than any battle cry. Elias felt a chill travel the length of his spine. He had seen eyes like those once in men hardened by war eyes that measured another's soul in an instant. This was no dumb beast staring at him. This was a guardian. He tightened his grip on the rifle slung across his shoulder, though he didn't raise it yet. His breath fogged in the cooling air, and for a moment it felt as though time had narrowed to the space between himself and the mare. Then he noticed the smaller shapes behind her. 3 foals huddled together in the dim interior, their coats still rough with youth. They trembled in the chill, pressing flank to flank their thin legs, wobbling. Their ears twitched at every sound, and their wide eyes darted toward their mother for assurance. The sight struck Elias deeper than the golden glare of the mare. Those foals, fragile and frightened, were not the heirs of wild dominion. They were children, and the Mustang, powerful though she stood, was not a terror of the mountains. She was a mother standing between danger and her young. Elias's chest tightened. He saw Clara, pale and fevered, shielding their boy with her body, even as illness drained her strength. He saw his son, no more than 5, clinging to her skirts with wide eyes that begged him to make it right. The memory lanced through him so sharp he nearly staggered. His hand moved before thought. In a single practiced motion, he raised his rifle, leveling it at the dark form in the doorway. The instinct of a soldier, drilled into him by years in the saddle, took command. A threat stood in his path. He was trained to eliminate it. But then the mare's eyes caught him again. There was no wild frenzy in them, no mindless rage. Only warning, steady and unwavering. The eyes of a creature that understood fear and resolve, that knew the weight of responsibility and would bear it to the death if need be. His arms trembled. The rifle wavered. He saw not an enemy, but a mirror of himself, a parent who had lost, who would fight with the last drop of strength for the ones that remained. Elias exhaled, the breath shuddering. Slowly he lowered the barrel until it pointed at the porch planks. His fingers loosened on the trigger. "Not you," he whispered, the words rough with something close to shame. "Not tonight. Not the fight I need." The mare didn't move. She didn't relax either. She simply stood, eyes locked on his, measuring him anew. The foals shifted behind her, and one gave a thin, uncertain whicker. The mare's ear flicked back toward the sound before returning her focus to him. Elias backed away a step, careful not to turn his back. He lifted his hand slightly, palms out, as if to show her he meant no harm. The porch groaned under his retreat. Another step, then another. The Mustang's head lowered fractionally, ears pricked forward. She didn't charge. She didn't flee. She held her ground, a living line between her young and the man who had nearly raised steel against her. The silence was taut as wire. Elias knew one wrong move, one sudden flinch would snap it. At the edge of the porch, he stopped. His heart hammered against his ribs, but he let his rifle rest against his shoulder and gave the mare a slow nod. "It's your cabin tonight," he said quietly. "I'll not push you from it." For a long moment, the two simply stared, man and beast, unwilling neighbors bound by circumstance. Then Elias eased himself down onto the outer boards of the porch, far enough from the door to give her space close enough to feel the wall at his back. The mare didn't follow. She turned her head slightly enough to keep him in her periphery, then shifted her weight as the foals pressed closer to her flanks. The sun disappeared beyond the peaks, and the mountain night came swiftly. Cold air swept through the pines, bringing with it a scattering of snowflakes. Elias drew his bedroll from the saddle and spread it against the porch boards, his movements deliberate and slow. He wrapped himself in his coat, tucking the edges tight against the bite of frost. The mountains were silent but for the sounds within the cabin. He heard the heavy thud of hooves against wood as the mare shifted. He heard the warm, rough breath of her lungs steady and strong. He heard the faintest nickers, soft and plaintive from the foals, followed by the mare's low, rumbling reassurance. Each sound throbbed with life. They seeped through the thin walls, a heartbeat of the wild, filling the silence with warmth Elias hadn't known for years. He lay there, listening, his eyes tracing the starlight, etched against the rafters above the porch. Memory came to him unbidden, Clara humming a lullaby, their boy curled safe in her lap. The crackle of a small hearth fire, the smell of bread, the sense of belonging. All gone now, buried in the ground, miles away. But here on this mountain, another mother sang in her own tongue, soothing her young. And for the first time in longer than he could recall, Elias didn't feel entirely hollow. His breath misted in the air. He drew his coat tighter and whispered into the night, "I reckon you're just like me, old girl. Lost more than you care to count, protecting what's left." The mare didn't answer, but he felt her presence steady and unyielding. He closed his eyes. For years he had drifted with no anchor, no reason to stop. But tonight, listening to the rhythm of hooves and breath and foals' soft cries, Elias felt the faint stir of something he had thought long dead. Perhaps he had found a place worth staying. Perhaps at last he had found a reason not to run. Dawn came to the mountains in hushed splendor. First, a thin wash of gray seeped across the ridges, then the higher peaks flared pink as though the stone itself had caught fire. The sun broke over the horizon in molten gold, spilling down into the valleys and through the veil of morning mist. Pine needles glittered with dew, and the breath of the earth rose in cool veils of steam from the creek below. Elias stirred on the porch boards, stiff from a night spent on wood. His back ached, his neck throbbed, but he was alive, and the silence of the night had gone unbroken. No predator had disturbed him, no storm had swept down. He pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders, savoring the crisp bite of mountain air. It smelled of pine resin, of damp soil, of something untainted by towns and gunpowder. The porch creaked as he shifted, and his gaze went to the cabin door. It still hung ajar, angled just enough to show a slice of shadow. Within that darkness, he glimpsed the shape of the black mare, her outline faint but steady, a guardian keeping her vigil. The golden eyes glowed faintly when the light touched them. Behind her, he sensed the foal's presence, though they remained hidden. For a long while, he didn't move. He simply watched the cabin as the day brightened. The mare did not charge. She did not vanish back into the depths. She stood like a sentinel, unshaken by the coming light. When Elias finally rose, brushing the frost from his coat, the cabin revealed itself more clearly. The first rays of sun stripped away the veil of dusk and showed him details he had not noticed the night before. The roof shingles, though silvered with age, were intact and neatly aligned. Where some had rotted, new ones had been placed, their color still pale. The walls, though scarred by weather, were reinforced by boards cut more recently. The windows glimmered in the sunlight, clean, not dulled by dust. Even the glass panes, so easily shattered in neglect, were whole. His gaze lifted to the chimney. Faint streaks of soot, black and fresh, clung to the stones. The ashes had not been there for years. They were months, perhaps weeks old. Someone had burned wood in that hearth not long ago. Through the half-open door, he caught another glimpse, shelves lining one wall, books still neatly in place. Their spines were straight, their colors dulled, but not ruined by insects or damp. A cabin left to rot would never keep such order. Elias's brow furrowed. His hand brushed the rifle at his side, not from fear, but unease. "Hartwell," he murmured under his breath, "what the devil were you telling me?" The old man's face rose in memory, sunken cheeks, lips, pale eyes, sharp and strange. Hartwell had spoken with the finality of a man on the edge of the grave, yet he had not lied about the deed, about the cabin's existence. What he had lied about, perhaps, was its abandonment. Abandoned cabins didn't smell of wood smoke. They didn't boast glass, without cracked shelves, without rot. Abandoned cabins weren't chosen by wild Mustangs for a winter den. Elias scratched his jaw rough with stubble. Something deeper stirred in him, a whisper of suspicion. Hartwell had not handed him a refuge. He had handed him a charge, a riddle to unravel. And in doing so, the old man had entangled him in something far larger than 7 cents worth of timber and stone. The thought should have soured his mood, but instead he felt a spark of curiosity flicker where once there had been only apathy. He hadn't felt that edge since before Clara's death, before the war had hollowed him out. He stepped closer to the doorway, his boots crunching softly on the frost. The mare stood within her body, filling the frame. Morning light caught the sheen of her coat, deep and black as obsidian. Her ears flicked toward him, her head tilting ever so slightly. Elias raised a hand palm out and spoke in a tone low and steady, the way he might to a skittish horse on the open range. "I'm not here to drive you out," he said. "Don't aim to take your house from you. Just need a corner to rest these bones. That's all." The words hung in the air, absurd, and one level he was talking to a horse as though she were a landlady. Yet as he spoke, something shifted in the mare's stance. Her head lifted, nostrils flaring. The golden eyes stayed fixed on him, bright and unnerving, but she did not lash out or retreat. Instead, she shifted her weight sideways enough to cover the foals behind her. The gesture was deliberate, protective, and to Elias, it felt like an answer. He lowered his hand. "Fair enough," he muttered. "You guard what's yours. Can't fault you for that." The mare snorted, a short exhale, warm mist in the chill. Her ears swiveled not toward him this time, but toward the tree line beyond the cabin. For a long moment, she stood perfectly still, listening. Her muscles tightened across her flanks. Elias followed her gaze. The forest lay quiet, the pines swaying in the breeze. He heard nothing but the distant call of a hawk and the babble of the creek. Yet the Mustang's body told another story. She was alert, tense, wary, not just of him, but of something else hidden in the timber. It unsettled him. A horse knew the language of danger long before a man caught scent of it. "You've been stalked," he whispered. "That it." The mare didn't turn, didn't ease. She simply kept listening, her tail flicking, her frame coiled as if ready. Elias let out a slow breath. She wasn't only tolerating his presence, she was using it, or at least weighing whether it might be of use. A creature that had every reason to despise mankind was showing something stranger than fear. She was showing calculation. The thought left his palms damp. This was no ordinary wild Mustang. She'd known people before or learned to read them. Elias backed a pace and lowered himself onto the porch again, setting the rifle across his knees. He studied the cabin anew, his eyes following the lines of the timbers, the stonework at the base. It was a solid build, sturdy enough to outlast winters that would tear lesser shelters apart. Someone had invested time, money, and skill into its making, and Hartwell had given it away for a handful of coins. The more Elias considered, the more the pieces refused to fit. A man didn't tend a cabin this well, only to abandon it. A man didn't hand another his property without cause. A man didn't look into Elias Boone's eyes with desperation unless there was more at stake. The mare's vigilance, the foal's trembling in her shadow, the quiet order of the books and hearth, all braided into a pattern Elias could not yet read. But he knew one thing, the truth was buried here. He leaned back against the porch post, eyes never leaving the cabin's shadow. "All right, Hartwell," he murmured, voice low enough only the mountain breeze might hear. "Whatever you set me on, I'll see it through. You drop me in the middle of it, like it or not." The mare's ears flicked again at the sound of his voice. She gave no sign of approval yet, no sign of hostility. Instead, she stood breathing steadily, her young pressed to her side. Elias sat in silence, letting the mountain sounds wash over him. The wind sighed in the branches, the creek whispered, the hawk cried again. Yet beneath those layers lay something more. A secret wrapped in stone and timber, guarded by a wild mare and foals that had chosen this cabin as sanctuary. And Elias, for the first time in years, felt himself tethered not to grief, not to wandering, but to the thread of mystery. He pulled the blanket around his shoulders once more and let the sun warm his face. Whatever waited in these walls, whatever Hartwell had left unsaid, it had already claimed him. And deep in his gut, he knew the black Mustang, the cabin, and Hartwell's cryptic charge were all part of a single truth. A truth he would have to uncover no matter how much blood or fire it cost. Elias waited until the sun had climbed fully over the peaks and the world had warmed enough for the snow on the upper ridges to soften. The black mare and her foals had left the cabin not long before slipping into the timberline with cautious grace. He had watched them descend toward the stream, the foals prancing clumsily after their mother, the mare pausing every few strides to check the air. It was the first chance he'd had to step inside the cabin without her golden eyes boring into him. He rose from the porch, slowly dusting the frost from his coat, and crossed the threshold. The air inside was cooler, tinged with the faint smoke of old fires and the must of wood shut away from sunlight. What struck him first was not neglect, but order. The floor was swept, the shelves intact, the hearth swept clean, though stained by fresh ash. Elias moved carefully, every sense alert. He ran his calloused hand along the mantel where soot smudged his skin. His gaze fell to the shelves of books pressed neatly against the wall. Their spines were stiff with use, not swollen with mildew. Whoever had tended this place had done so recently. Hartwell had called it abandoned, sold it for the price of a nail. But Elias's instincts told him otherwise. He shifted his rifle in hand and tapped the butt against the floorboards as he paced. Once, twice, thrice, solid oak responded with dull thuds. Then near the hearthstone, The sound changed. A hollow echo. He froze, cocking his head. His years in bivouacs and field camps had taught him the language of hollow wood, of secret caches dug beneath planks. His pulse quickened. "Something's hid down there," he muttered. He knelt and rapped the plank again, his ear tilted toward it. The echo was unmistakable. Beneath that square of flooring space existed where none should. Elias slipped the hunting knife from his belt and worked its edge into the seam. The board resisted, at first swollen with years of mountain damp. He pressed harder, prying, until the wood creaked and lifted. Splinters bit into his palms, but at last the board gave way. The shadows beneath revealed not just empty earth, but the faint gleam of wood. He widened the gap and glimpsed the shape of a chest wedged between support beams. With a grunt, he set aside the board and reached down. The box was heavy, the cedar darkened by age and damp. He struggled, bracing his boots, tugging until it scraped free. By the time he laid it on the cabin floor, sweat ran down his temples, though the air was cold. He crouched over it, breath misting in the dim light. The chest was carved, its surface decorated with fine patterns, pine needles interlaced with suns and stars. Dust covered the grooves, but the workmanship still spoke of care. Whoever had fashioned it had done so with devotion. Elias ran his thumb over the carvings, feeling their depth. This was no common storage box. This was something meant to endure. A rusty iron clasp sealed it shut. He wedged the tip of his knife into the hinge and leaned hard. The metal screeched, resisting until it snapped with a sharp crack. A whiff of damp air rushed out, carrying the scent of old paper and cedar. For a moment, Elias sat motionless, staring at the box as though it were alive. Then he pulled the lid open. Inside, carefully stacked and wrapped in oilskin, lay documents. He drew the first bundle free and unrolled it on the floorboards. It was a map, hand-drawn, precise, and startlingly detailed. Valleys, creeks, ridges, every contour of the surrounding mountains marked with an expert's hand. Symbols dotted the parchment, triangles, circles, arrows, cryptic at first glance, but clearly systematic. He had seen miners' maps before, rough things scratched by fortune seekers. This was different. Professional. The next parchment made his jaw tighten. It was a survey of mineral deposits, complete with notes in a neat, practiced script. Silver veins, quartz seams, markers of wealth buried deep in stone. At the bottom of the page, written in Hartwell's unmistakable hand, estimated value millions. Enough to shape the fate of the territory. Elias set the page aside and rifled deeper. More maps, more calculations, annotations that spoke of geology far beyond his ken. Symbols repeated themselves like a code marking coordinates, perhaps, or something more guarded. Then he found the loose sheet, smaller, folded in half, its edges frayed. He opened it, and his blood ran cold. The words were shaky but legible, ink pressed deep by a failing hand. Elias Boone. This land belongs to you. Do not let them destroy it. He read it once, then again, and a third time. Each reading drove the weight heavier into his chest. How? His voice rasped in the empty cabin. How in hell's name did you know my name? His hands trembled around the page. He and Hartwell had spoken only a day before, strangers in a dusty town. Yet this note spoke with the intimacy of foresight, as if the old man had been watching him long before they met. The memory of Hartwell's eyes returned to him, cold, sharp, yet lined with desperation. Perhaps the sale had never been random. Perhaps Hartwell had studied him, tested him, chosen him deliberately. Elias pressed the page flat on his thigh, staring at his name scrawled in another man's hand. Chosen. The word chilled him. What had the old man seen, a drifter with nothing left to lose, a soldier hollowed by war and grief. Was that why he'd been picked? Because greed could not tempt him? Because he had nothing left to bribe or to break? His throat tightened. For years he had been nothing but a shell, drifting with the wind. Now suddenly he was tethered to a task he hadn't asked for, a duty pressed upon him by a dying man's design. He shoved the papers back into the chest, hands unsteady. The maps, the valuations, the coordinates, proof of something immense. He had no desire for mines or fortunes, but the paper in his hand told him others did. The mare's sound broke the silence. He looked up sharply. The black Mustang stood in the doorway, her frame blocking the sunlight. The foals clustered around her legs, their eyes wide and curious. She gazed at Elias with that steady, unsettling calm. In her eyes, he read no surprise, no alarm. Only recognition. It was absurd to think so, but the look she gave him was the look of one who knew, as if she had sensed what he had uncovered beneath the boards. Elias's fingers tightened on the cedar box. "You knew, didn't you?" he whispered, though he felt foolish speaking aloud. "You've been guarding this same as you guard your young." The mare's breath steamed in the cold air. Her ears flicked, her gaze unwavering. Behind her, the foals shifted, pressing close. Elias held her stare until his chest ached. Then he looked down at the box, at the carved symbols etched in cedar. The maps, the warnings, the scrawled letter bearing his name. The mare, the cabin, Hartwell. They were threads of the same weave. He felt it in his bones. Whatever game had been set in motion, he was in the middle of it now. He could no longer drift away like a lost rider down some endless trail. The land had chosen him. Hartwell had chosen him. And the mare, standing sentinel in the door, seemed to mark him with her gaze, as if to say, "Now you know. And now you're bound." Elias closed the chest, his hand firm on the lid. The sound echoed in the cabin like a gunshot of finality. There was no going back. The afternoon weighed heavy upon the ridge. Clouds crawled in from the west, dragging long shadows over the tree line. The wind, which all morning had been steady from the south, turned abruptly and began to funnel cold down the valley. Elias Boone felt the change deep in his bones. He had spent too many years in the saddle, too many nights camped in the open, not to know what a restless sky could foretell. The first signs came from the small things. Sparrows burst from the thickets in nervous flurries. A pair of ravens wheeled overhead, croaking harshly before they fled downslope. The forest grew oddly hushed, the kind of silence that meant something larger pressed against its borders. Inside the cabin, the black mare stiffened. Her ears pricked forward, her muscles taut as bowstrings. She shoved her foals toward the darkest corner of the cabin, their thin bodies trembling as they pressed against the wall. Elias, standing just outside the doorframe, felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. His soldier's instincts dulled by years of grief, but never truly gone. Whispered through him like the edge of a blade, "Something's coming." And it isn't friendly. The ground trembled first, faint as a heartbeat. Elias crouched against the outer wall of the cabin, listening. A low grinding soon followed the groan of iron-rimmed wheels on stone. Then came the thunder of hooves, rhythmic and insistent. He slipped into the brush a few paces from the cabin, his rifle cradled but not yet raised. Through the pines, he caught sight of movement on the wagon trail that wound upward from the valley. A convoy emerged, slow but purposeful. 2 freight wagons labored behind teams of horses, their tarps lashed tight. Around them rode 6 armed men, their mounts lathered, their saddles heavy with rifles. Every rider wore the same hardened look, faces tanned and scarred, coats of stiff hide, creaking as they shifted in their saddles. They carried themselves with the confidence of men long accustomed to danger. They were no prospectors out on a whim. These were fighting men, hired guns, seasoned in violence. The way they moved, flanking, scanning, keeping intervals, told Elias everything. They were soldiers of coin, and the coin came from someone with deep pockets. He pressed himself flatter against the ground, heart hammering. The wagons halted at a bend where the trail widened just below the slope. The riders dismounted, their boots grinding on gravel as they spread out to scout. Voices carried upward clear in the crisp mountain air. Hartwell's dead one barked, his tone flat, as if announcing the weather. The boss wants the ore's samples taken down to Denver before sundown. Then we clear the place. Another spat into the dust. What about the horses? Word is that black Mustang's been nesting here. Boss says burn 'em. Wild stock ain't worth the trouble. And the cabin put it to the torch. Don't leave a splinter standing. Whatever Hartwell left behind dies with him. The men chuckled grimly, as though burning homes and killing beasts was nothing more than another day's task. From his hiding place, Elias felt his chest tighten. Their words were iron nails in his stomach. Hartwell hadn't simply died, as folks in town assumed. He had been silenced, murdered, and these men had come to wipe away the last of his work, along with any living thing that stood in their way. Elias's grip on his rifle turned his knuckles white. His pulse thundered in his ears, but he forced himself still. To rush now would be suicide. Better to listen to gather what he could. One man stood apart, larger than the rest. His jaw was broad, a pale scar slashing from chin to ear. He spoke with a voice that cut through the others' chatter. No mistakes, the scarred leader commanded. This is the Rocky Mountain Mining Association's claim now. We make it clean, we make it final. You know who signs our pay. The name came like a whip crack, among them the association. Elias had heard of it, an infamous syndicate of mine barons who seized lands with bribes and bullets alike. But the scarred man went further, his next words chilling Elias's blood. Deputy Marshal Webb himself guarantees protection. As long as we deliver Denver, won't ask questions. Elias nearly swore aloud. Deputy Marshal Marcus Webb, the same polished officer who paraded in town squares in crisp uniforms, all polished brass, and speeches about law and order. Webb was a figure of respect, the sort men saluted when he passed. To hear his name tied to this pack of cutthroats, it was as though the ground itself shifted beneath Elias. If Webb was backing them, then no badge, no court in Colorado could be trusted. The scarred man gestured toward the ridge. Finish it fast. We're not lingering after dark. The hired guns nodded and moved to their tasks. Elias flattened himself against the cabin wall, his chest tight. The fragments of Hartwell's puzzle slid into place. The box of maps. The trembling hand that had written his name. The urgent command, do not let them destroy it. Hartwell hadn't sold him a cabin. He had entrusted him with a battlefield. The mare inside shifted her hooves, thudding against the boards as she paced before her foals. Elias glanced toward her shadowed form through the half-open door. The golden eyes glowed, faintly fixed on the same menace that pressed at his heart. She knew. She had always known. These men weren't just intruders. They were predators no less dangerous than wolves. And she had been standing guard over this cabin because she sensed their approach long before Elias ever did. His breath came slow, deliberate, as he leaned his back against the wall. He was no stranger to war. He had fought in fields choked with cannon smoke, had watched comrades fall by musket and saber. But this was different. There was no army banner here, no cause sanctioned by generals. Only a lonely cabin, a chest of damning papers, a widow's son with nothing left to lose, and a black mare defending her young. The stakes were not honor or territory. They were survival and truth. For a fleeting moment, temptation clawed at him. He could run, slip down the far slope, vanish into timber, let the hired guns have their way. He could ride east, chase some other road, until his horse collapsed beneath him. That was what he'd been doing for years anyway, wandering, avoiding routes, avoiding purpose. But the thought curdled almost as quickly as it came. If he left the mare, and her foals would die before sundown, Hartwell's maps would burn. The last testament of a man who had trusted him would be scattered to ash. And in his heart, Elias knew the truth he had already run too many times. He had run from grief, from the graves of his wife and son, from the silence that followed them. He had buried himself in empty trails and forgotten towns, trying to become nothing. But fate, damn her cruel hand, had dragged him here. The mare's eyes found him through the dim doorway, unblinking. In them he saw the same weariness, the same refusal to yield. She was a mother stripped down to instinct, prepared to stand between danger and her young until her last breath. Something inside Elias cracked and then hardened. He saw in her not just an animal, but a mirror, two souls broken by loss, now drawn into a fight they could not abandon. His hand curled around the worn stock of his rifle. The wood, smoothed by years of use, fit his palm like an old friend. If blood's to spill, he whispered under his breath, then let it be theirs. The ridge had fallen quiet again. The wagons and riders had pulled back down the slope, making camp in a hollow where the smoke from their fires rose in thin threads. Elias Boone stood at the window, slit watching, until the last rider disappeared beneath the trees. The mare inside had settled but not relaxed. Her ears stayed sharp, her muscles taut. The foals pressed against her, still shivering from the tremors of fear. Elias knew he had little time. If those men planned to strike at sundown, he had hours at best. Hartwell's warning echoed in his mind. Keep the cabin by any means necessary. He turned away from the window, scanning the room once more. The cabin's simplicity masked something deeper. He could feel it. He paced before the hearth, running his fingers across the stonework, the seams of the floorboards. Years of soldiering had sharpened his instincts. He trusted the itch that crawled between his shoulders when secrets lurked nearby. His boot heels struck a board that sounded different. He froze. Then he knelt, rapping the wood with his knuckles. The tone was hollow, an empty drum where there should have been solidity. The plank lay near the base of the hearth, its edges worn smooth, as though pried more than once in the past. The seams gaped just enough to betray use. Elias slipped the tip of his knife into the gap and worked it gently. The wood resisted, at first swollen by damp and heat, but he pressed harder, levering with patience, until the plank lifted with a groan. A draft of air drifted up, cool and heavy, carrying the smell of earth and metal. It wasn't the scent of a wine cellar or a food store. This was stone iron, the bones of the mountain itself. Elias crouched over the opening, staring into the darkness, yawning below. The space stretched downward farther than he'd expected, shadows swallowing the shape of rough steps. "This ain't no cellar for turnips," he muttered. The stairwell dropped narrow-cut between beams that supported the cabin's weight. Elias lowered himself carefully, rifle in hand, each step creaking under his boots. The darkness pressed close, and his heart quickened as if he were once again a cavalryman, descending into the unknown. At the bottom, his boots struck solid stone. The chamber opened just wide enough for him to stand. The air was clammy, stale with time, yet faint traces of oil and smoke lingered. Against one wall sat a small table, and on it an oil lamp, its glass smudged but intact. Elias touched the side, found the reservoir heavy with fuel, and struck a match. The flame flared, then steadied. Golden light pushed back the shadows. The cellar revealed itself in detail, and Elias drew a sharp breath. The place was no common storage. Against the far wall lay crates stacked with rocks, each chunk labeled in careful handwriting. He lifted one its weight, pulling against his arm, and tilted it under the lamp. Silver gleamed faintly in the stone's veins, bright as moonlight. Another rock glittered with copper traces, another with flecks of manganese. These were not the random trophies of a prospector. They were samples cataloged and preserved with methodical care. Beside the crates leaned tools of a kind Elias had rarely seen. A compass polished to precision, a steel rod etched with calibrations, rolled maps printed in Denver, their edges frayed but legible, showing geological formations in intricate detail. Whoever worked here had wielded science as deftly as a miner swung a pick. On the table lay journals, leather-bound, each page filled with Hartwell's tidy script. Elias opened one at random. The handwriting was firm, the notes meticulous measurements of strata, calculations of depth, estimates of yield. Margins crowded with symbols identical to those he'd seen on the cedar box upstairs. He read a line that made him sit back on his heels, estimated value multiple millions. Richest vein in the territory, enough to control Colorado's future. Elias closed the book, rubbing his jaw. The numbers meant little to him, but the weight of them was undeniable. Fortunes had driven men to kill for less. He turned to a wooden chest set in a niche of the wall. The lid creaked as he opened it, revealing bundles of envelopes bound with twine. The paper had yellowed, the ink smudged by damp, but the addresses were clear. Governor's Office, Colorado Territory. Department of Land Management. Interior Bureau, Washington City. Each letter bore Hartwell's hand. Elias tugged one free, broke the seal, and read, "To whom it may concern, I must report unlawful and destructive mining practices perpetrated by the Rocky Mountain Association. They poison streams, displace settlers, and employ armed men to secure claims illegally." The words cut with urgency, plea after plea. Elias rifled through the stack. Letter after letter repeated the warnings, each more desperate than the last. But nearly all bore the same stamps in heavy ink: returned, not accepted. Some were unopened entirely, the wax seals unbroken. Elias's mouth twisted in bitter understanding. The truth had never reached its intended ears. Hartwell had shouted into the void, and those with power had silenced him before his words could spread. "God help us," Elias muttered, fingers curling around the bundle. He tried the right way, and they slammed every door. He imagined Hartwell weary and alone, still writing, still sending letters into the dark, clinging to hope that someone might listen. And when no one did, he built this cellar, his last refuge for truth, hidden under the boards. Elias sat heavily on a crate, the lamp's glow flickering across his face. His mind swirled as the pieces settled into place. Hartwell had been no eccentric landowner, guarding a worthless shack. He had been a man of conscience, gathering proof against the association. And the association had answered the way such men always did, with coin and with guns. Deputy Marshal Webb had lent them his authority. His badge bought silence where Hartwell's words demanded action. Together, they had buried the truth. And when Hartwell refused to yield, they buried him too. Elias let out a long breath, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He spoke aloud, though only the cellar walls heard. "You didn't sell me a cabin, old man. You left me the fight you couldn't finish." The lamp flame trembled, casting the shadows of his shoulders long against the wall. He remembered Clara's voice faint as she clutched his hand, whispering for him to live. He remembered the boy's small chest, stilled by fever. He had failed them both, or so he told himself every night. But now he felt the raw edge of purpose cut through his grief. "They took everything from me," he whispered. "But they won't take this land. Not the mare. Not her young. Not the truth." Above, the mare stamped her hoofbeats, reverberating through the beams. Elias lifted his eyes toward the sound, a faint smile touching his lips. He was not alone. She was up there keeping her vigil. For the first time in years, Elias Boone did not feel like a drifter without anchor. He felt like a sentinel tied to this place by blood and by oath. Hartwell's charge had become his own. Elias extinguished the lamp and climbed the narrow stairs, the journals and letters pressed against his chest. As he lifted the plank back into place, sealing the cellar once more, he felt the weight of both burden and resolve settle on his shoulders. No longer a wandering cowboy, no longer a man with nothing left. Elias Boone emerged into the cabin with the quiet certainty of one reborn. The black mare watched him, golden eyes gleaming. The foals huddled behind her, safe in the dark. Elias set the bundle of papers on the table and met her gaze. "We'll hold it," he said softly. "You and me. We'll hold it." And the mare snorted once the sound, sharp and certain, as though in answer. Night fell with the finality of a dropped curtain, and the ridge lit like a line of coals. Campfires from the hired men pulsed below their glow, staining the low clouds red. Hooves thudded, tack jingled, boots scuffed over gravel as figures spread through the trees. They moved with practiced economy, forming a ring that tightened around the cabin, until Elias could hear the scrape of leather on bark and the creak of gun belts when the wind paused to listen. He stood by the window slit with his rifle laid along the sill cheek, pressed to the cold stock. Torches drifted through the pines like a swarm of fireflies, drifting, doubling back, testing, probing. Sweat pricked his scalp despite the chill. He felt none of it in his eyes. They were ice. "They don't just want ore," he murmured. "They want the last of Hartwell erased." A sound split the night, the black mare's high trumpet, bright and furious. It ricocheted off stone and came back from the opposite ridge as if another horse answered. The foals startled and crowded behind her. She strode to the doorway and planted herself there, mane standing, hooves striking the floorboards with the contained thunder of a storm. Her eyes, those coins of gold, burned in the torchlight. Elias, caught off guard, felt something like awe. "Even the wild know it," he breathed. "This one's for keeps." A voice barked from the dark drive out the horses, "Bring Boone in alive or not, don't matter." Elias snapped the barrel up and sent a single round into the sky. The shot tore the quiet in two and rolled down the valley like a drum. For a heartbeat, the ring of torches steadied. Men muttered. Saddles squeaked. A rider near the porch swore, lifted his carbine, and fired. The slug chewed a furrow through the eaves and spat splinters across the stoop. The mare flinched and screamed, whirling to shield her young. Elias's stomach turned hard. He felt the old heat rise clean, blinding righteous. "You damned fools," he said, and the words came out flat as a blade. He thumbed cartridges into the tube and took 2 deliberate steps into the doorway, half his body framed in firelight. "One more step," he said, voice raw and iron at once, "and you die where you stand." The line stuttered. Someone hissed a curse. Another rider shifted as if the ground itself had moved. The voice of a veteran has an edge. Men do not mistake, not bravado, but the calm that children fear in a father they have pushed too far. The mare held beside him, shoulder to shoulder, the quietest ally a man ever had. Elias slid back from the door and crossed to the hearth. He levered up the loosened plank, lowered the lamp with one hand, and dropped into the stairwell. Shadows climbed the walls as he moved. Beyond the journals and crates, beyond the samples and the maps, he found what his fingers had hoped and his mind had dreaded, a low door. Let into the stone, a bar of iron securing it. He wrenched it up, and a smell of oil met him. Inside, rifles wrapped in oiled cloth, a pair of heavy pistols, tin boxes of caps and bullets, paper cartridges stacked in rows like hymnals. Hartwell had been a surveyor and a man who read the Times. Elias drew a rifle, and a pistol checked locks and springs, set out powder wads shot. He worked by the rhythm of muscle memory, tear poor wad ram, until a neat pyramid of loaded cartridges lined the shelf and 3 rifles leaned within easy reach. He slung a bag across his chest and divided bullets into small pouches he could work one-handed. On the steps he paused. His thumb slid the length of a burnished stock, and ghosts came not to blind him, but to stand behind him. Clara's soft hand, the boy's small laugh. Hartwell's papery voice, the mare's eyes steady and hard. He swallowed. Maybe that's why he whispered into the cool air. You knew a man with nothing left can stand to the last. He climbed, replaced the board, and dragged furniture into barricades. Table braced against the door, chairs toppled to make a tangle, the bookshelf laid on its side to thicken the wall. The mare hissed through her teeth, a razor whisper. The foals crouched, ears flat but calm. Elias checked the sights, rolled his shoulders back, and took the doorway once more. You want blood, he called in a low, carrying voice. Let the ground drink yours first. He did not feel like a drifter then. He felt rooted, a man grown out of the earth, with the cabin for his trunk and the wild for his crown. The night taking his measure seemed to lean back. He moved fast between lamp and cellar, stalking the upper room from below, rifles, powder horns, loose shot that glimmered like frost in the lamplight. Sacks of grain and a stack of dry goods made a waist-high breastwork across the kitchen door. He wedged a beam against the front latch and pulled a spare plank over the window slit to narrow its mouth. The mare stood square, blocking the narrow doorway to the back room where the foals hid head-low, ears fixed forward, the carved figurehead of a ship that had learned it could ram. Downslope, the circle breathed in. Boots whispered through pine needles. Torchlight bent in the wind and brightened when men broke from cover. Elias heard the rasp of a match and then saw the arc of a torch sailing toward the porch. It struck the wall and flared up with a greedy cough. Smoke crawled under the eaves. Elias slid to the firing slit and cut the thrower down with a single shot. The man jerked and folded the torch, tumbling into the dirt, its flame stuttering. Answering fire came at once, hard, heavy volleys that peppered the wall and set the cabin humming like a struck bell. Plaster dust fell in faint white veils. The mare stamped and held. Come on then, Elias said through his teeth. Come see what you're buying. He did not wait to be overrun. The cellar's crooked vein gave him an idea. He popped the floorboard, slid down, and tucked through a crawl he'd noticed earlier. A low, brush-choked slit that opened into the snow grass behind the cabin. He eased out under a tangle of fir roots, belly to earth, the smell of sap thick in his throat. A man with his back to the wall kept his eyes forward. These men had no reason to check the ground beneath their heels. 2 riders crouched behind a stump, trading whispers and cartridges. Elias put a round into the nearer and a second into the man's partner before the first body had slumped fully. He slid backward into the hole as the stump exploded under wild return fire, rolled down the cramped passage, and climbed into the kitchen, breath-burning heart steadying to its old drum. A boot hit the door. Hinges groaned. The beam held. Then a shoulder slammed the wood, and a third time a man burst through into chaos and splinters. He had time for one astonished breath before the mare hit him. She drove him back into the threshold with the violence of a falling tree, and when he tried to rise, she hammered him down with both forehooves. His cry cut off short and awful. Elias racked the rifle and barked voice hoarse and carrying. "This is my ground. Back off or die here." The circle wavered. A wounded animal smell, a human scream, and a voice that did not lie. Men who worked for money felt their pay turn thin. A sound rolled in from the high timber, then older than money, older than men, a wolf's long shivering call. Another answered, and another, until the ridge sang with it. Powder, smoke, blood, and shouting made a promise to the wild, and the wild had come to collect. Shadows moved in the trees at a distance that made the hair lift on Elias's arms. Wolves slid through the brush, gray and silent as the cold. The first hit a rider's panicked horse at the hock. The second took a staggering man at the calf. Shots flashed bright and blind, and for a moment gunfire ceased to be aimed and became prayer. Elias kept his fire tight, taking opportunities when a muzzle swung wide or a silhouette cut against flame. He heard a man shout for help, another to hold the line, another to run. Panic is a language as plain as English. In the smoke, he lost sight of the mare. He called a single wordless sound and felt emptiness widen. Then she blasted from the shadow, whole furious mane, singed eyes lit like coins in a furnace. She shoved her foals toward the cut in the slope, with a whip quickness of head and shoulder, drove them into the safe seam, and turned. She came up the steps as if climbing a wave. A man lunged through the ruined doorway with a knife. She hit him in the breastbone and flung him into the yard like a sack. Another put his gun up and fired high. Elias's shot caught him before he could chamber again. For the first time, the men understood that what opposed them was not one stubborn ranch hand, but a web of defenders, the land, the wolves, the storm, the man, the mare, and their courage broke in places it would not mend tonight. Wind rose as if summoned by the wolves' voices. The campfires below bowed and streamed, then reached. A tongue of flame licked into grass. Dry needles took like paper. Light poured up the slope, red licking to the height of men's faces and showing them each other's fear. Fall back, someone bawled. Elias heard a different crack and smiled without mirth. It was not a rifle. It was the sound of a tree listing. He had weakened 3 pines at noon with a hatchet shaving their roots, ready to go on the pull of a rope. He put his shoulder to the lines he'd knotted to the rafters and heaved. The first pine groaned, tipped, and went sweeping the slope clean, taking 2 men and a horse with it. The second followed, and the third, a smaller trunk that pinned a fleeing rider by the thigh. Howls rose, not only the wolves. Men cried to men, and men got no answer back. The scarred leader rallied at the bend below, cursing them to stand. Smoke threw light and shadow across his face until he looked carved from coal. "We're not dying on a farmer's porch," he shouted, and he spurred for the gap blade flashing. Elias stepped onto a granite nub at the cabin's corner, the Hartwell rifle snugged to his shoulder, the stock warm now, the sights a clean black notch against a world of fire. For a heartbeat, all paths in him met war and widowerhood wandering in the mare's bright eyes, and became a single straight line. He squeezed. The leader pitched from the saddle as if a string had been cut. His horse bolted, reins dancing, and the men who'd followed him checked as if they'd struck a wall. Someone screamed to run. Someone else already had. They broke scattering into pine and flame, throwing rifles to gain speed, flinging torches aside that only served the fire's hunger. By the time the last rifle echo died, the cabin stood like a tired sentinel. Boards, split shingles, curled smoke leaking from the eaves where stray sparks had bitten. Elias Boone moved through its dim interior with the gait of a man who had outlived the hour he was meant to die. Outside, wolves faded to gray rumors among the pines. The surviving gunman had broken and run. He could feel the mountain waiting quiet as a held breath, not yet believing the fight was done. He lifted the hearth plank and dropped once more into the cool dark of the cellar. His lamp found the iron-banded cabinet he hadn't touched before, shoved behind ore crates as if forgotten. Its door powder-bloomed with age. The keyhole glittered. There was no key. Elias wedged his knife under the lip and pried until the seam squealed, and the door gave with a cough of rust. Inside lay a roll of vellum and paper bound with red wax. He broke a seal and unfolded a sheaf of thick pages, each stamped with federal crests that made his fingers go numb. The ink was precise, official, unsentimental. Samuel Hartwell was no land-poor gentleman gone odd with age. He was a federal undercover, a government man buried in the Rockies, with orders to map corruption as carefully as he mapped ore. Report after report signed, witness listed the names of men who wore the people's trust like a borrowed coat, judges who sold rulings for company stock, territorial clerks who erased titles for coin army lieutenants who looked the other way as rivers ran black. On the last page, Hartwell's hand had sharpened into a point, Deputy Marshal Marcus Webb lever and hinge of the whole machine. Elias sat on a crate and felt the weight of years settle around his shoulders. "Old man," he said into the lamp's hiss, "you fought it alone." A low boom rolled up the slope. The lamp wick trembled. Elias lifted his head. Outside, the wolves were gone, but a new sound took their place. The slosh and clatter of barrels and the barked haste of men who had found courage again in orders they could obey without looking anyone in the eye. Rollum, a voice shouted from the dark hollow below. "Webb says, burn the valley. Nothing left but ash." Barrels thumped and bounded, thudding against rocks splitting open with wet cracks. The smell of kerosene reached Elias as a raw sting. A torch arced fell, and a ribbon of grass took flame, then another and another, until the slope wrote itself in cursive fire. The pines began to pop sharp, ugly snaps as resin went to steam. Smoke at first, a veil thickened into a wall. Horses screamed. Somewhere beyond the first red wave, a stag bolted and stumbled, tumbling into a ravine it had crossed 100 times alive. Elias stood with Hartwell's files clutched to his chest and understood with a clarity that burned colder than fear the gunmen did not need to win. They only needed to erase. He came up out of the cellar into a room already lit as if by a red dawn. The mayor wheeled to face him, nostrils flaring, Foals pressed to the far wall. Fire skittered across the porch like a living thing testing the boards, then licking along the grain. "We go through," he told her, as if she could weigh the truth in his voice. "Or we die here." The words steadied him. He cinched the files under his coat, tied them with a length of saddle thong, and slung a rifle. The mare drove her foals to the rear doorway, where the slope fell away in scrub and rock. Elias kicked the barricade aside and shouldered out into air hot as a forge. The mountain had become a furnace. Flame ran uphill in thin, hungry lines, pausing only where stone forced it to choose. Smoke spun in dirty banners. Elias pulled his bandana over his mouth, tasted wool and ash. A pair of the association stragglers' faces, black with soot, lunged from behind a boulder, but their shots went wild in the moving light. Elias fired once to spoil their nerve and shouldered past with the mare at his side, pushing through spruce that shivered with heat. They found the seam of an old game trail and took it at a half-run. When flame fell across it, the mare hit the burning brush with her chest and shouldered it down hooves, flashing, making a space just wide enough for the foals to dart through with squealing strides. Heat grazed Elias's cheek, hair curled in the fire's breath. The oily taste of kerosene sat on his tongue like a lie. "Keep moving," he rasped to the mare, or himself he couldn't tell. "Keep your babies between us." A tree wrenched and fell, showering sparks. The foals faltered. The mare snapped her teeth at one and sent it leaping. Elias sidestepped the trunk, fired again into a moving shape, more to clear space than to kill, and felt the recoil anchor him. Behind the noise of his blood, he heard the far cry of wolves, thin now distant, folding themselves back into night as men's disaster grew too big, even for scavengers. A narrow spill of rock offered shelter, a crouch-high cleft, where a water seeped from deep stone, slicking the granite with a pale sheen. Elias shoved the files against his chest, with both hands stripped off his coat, and wrapped the bundle 3 times, tying the last knot with his teeth. He slithered into the crack and wedged the packet between wet stone and colder stone packing sod and damp moss around it with brutal care. "If I don't make it," he told the rock and the mare, "and whoever might one day listen, let the truth live longer than me." The mare pressed her shoulder against him. Her breath washed hot over his ear, a bellows turning. He touched her neck once, the briefest thanks, and crawled back out into the orange storm. They waited there, he and the Mustangs, in the steam of the seep and the roar of the blaze, until the main front passed. Sparks flew like locusts, but died when they hit the wet. Elias sat with his back to the stone and the rifle across his knees and measured his breaths. Each one burned less than the last. When at last the wind turned and the fire showed them its back, he led the little band through the black stepping where he had to, and carrying one foal when it balked. The cabin was a charred box crouched in smoke. The wolves were gone to their dens. The hired men had left nothing to finish but the mountain's own anger. 3 dawns later, with the files dried before a cautious fire and wrapped anew in oiled cloth, Elias rode for Denver. The land along the way bore new scars, streaks of black and gray, as if a giant hand had pressed ash into the hills. Ranchers stood with hats in hand, counting what the flames had left them. Forest turned to colonnades of char. Elias slept in dry washes and abandoned line shacks, eating what he carried and drinking where the creeks still ran clear. The mare and her young he left in the care of a hidden hollow. He knew where seep-fed grass would return first. Before he rode on alone, she stood on the lip of the hollow and watched him go ears forward, saying nothing a man could hear and everything a man could understand. Denver smelled of coal smoke and horse sweat, and its streets rang with iron tires and hard shoes. Elias found the Gazette in a brick building that carried its own heat like a stove. Inside, the air snapped with ink and newsprint. Men shouted copy. Girls ran with proofs like sparrows with bright scraps. He asked for Abigail Reeves. The clerk looked him once over, decided he wasn't there to sell subscriptions, and pointed him down a hall where typewriter keys ticked to themselves like insects. She was younger than the gravity of her name. Brown hair, pulled back sleeves rolled to the elbow, ink on her fingers, eyes that cut to the point. She didn't stand when he entered. She measured him, then the bundle in his hands. "I know you," she said. "You're the man Sheriff Tully claims shot up a mining camp over the ridge." "Sheriff Tully left before the shooting started," Elias said. "I brought you something he never would." He set Hartwell's files on her desk and undid the thong. She reached for the top report with both hands, the way a person receives a birth or a death. She read a line, then a paragraph, then a page. When she spoke again, her voice was a shade lower. "God in heaven," she breathed. "These are signed, stamped. He sent them up the chain, and they never came down again. She flipped to a list. This is a judge. This one a land officer. And she found Webb's name and stopped. If this is true, they'll hunt us for printing it. Elias's face didn't move. They're already hunting. The mountain burned because of what's in your hands. Abigail lifted her eyes. Whatever softness had been there lowered its visor. Who was Hartwell to you, the man who bought me a cabin for 7 cents and asked me to guard it with my life? Elias said. The man who died for your story. She set the sheaf down. The newsroom noise fell back. All right, she said. We'll check every signature. We'll match every seal. When it goes to press, it won't be rumor. It'll be a hammer. They'll come, Elias said simply. Her mouth crooked in something like a smile that had forgotten how to be pleasant. Let them. He nodded once. Print it for him, and for the mayor who stood in the door. For a heartbeat, she didn't understand. Then she did, and the look she gave him said she had learned enough about the West to know that sometimes the line between what breathes and what matters is not the one you expect. They ran proofs under gaslight, bent over the files until the white of the paper bit their eyes. Abigail sent trusted stringers to courthouse basements and territorial offices to look for duplicates. She wired the East for a lawyer who knew the difference between slander and courage. She sat at her desk through 2 nights without rising, except to sharpen a pencil. By the 3rd dawn, the room held its breath. The Gazette hit the street at sunup with ink still tacky. The headline bucked across the page like a thrown horse, Rocky Mountain Mining Association, a machine of crime. Under it, facsimiles of SEALs' names spelled out in the type that had killed better reputations than these dates that fit too closely to be lies. Hartwell's title printed in full, Special Investigator Federal Assignation, and his end left blank where a date would have been. Denver roared. Men who had called Webb a pillar spat his name into the gutter. Clerks with delicate hands traced the stamped circles with their thumbs as if to be certain. In Washington City, a senator who had made speeches about frontier virtue pounded his desk and demanded inquiry. A committee obliged. Telegraph keys jumped. Warrants followed paper the way thunder follows lightning. Marcus Webb did not go quietly. He put on his uniform, shined the badge that had purchased so much silence, and rode to the courthouse to explain how ink could be mistaken. But ink is an ungentle creditor. It came due in a pair of iron bracelets snapped shut by a U.S. Marshal who had once admired Webb without thinking about it too much. Reporters pressed to see. Women in shawls whispered about time. Webb turned his face slightly from the cameras, and for the first time in a long time, no one obeyed his wish. The association's headmen sprouted like quail from brush when the hounds come bolting for trains for telegraphs for lawyers. Some found all 3. Enough found bars. Courts read the Gazette with a careful finger and then read the law with a carefuler one. Guilty men wore their first honest expressions in years' astonishment that the world could still hurt them. On the 3rd week, the territorial governor announced what the Gazette's editor had already printed as inevitable: the association dissolved. Its assets seized in trust. Washington, prickly with embarrassment, sent a delegation westward that either wanted to help or wanted its share of credit. It didn't matter which. The effect was the same. The region shook itself like a dog come up from a river and began for the first time in memory to smell clean. Through it all, Hartwell's name traveled from mouth to mouth like a proper prayer. He was according to one street preacher who had never met him, the martyr of the high country. Elias Boone found the phrase too dressed. He preferred the simple truth the old man had done his job until it killed him. But he said nothing. He stood at the edge of crowds when he had to be in town and slipped away when he could. If anyone asked, he was the man who brought the papers. If anyone pressed, he said he had a cabin to see to. In March, under a pale sky and a wind that promised thaw, Elias stood on a rough-planked platform beside a cluster of officials. The Gazette called it a ceremony, though it had the look of something the land itself had written and men had merely co-signed. A stout clerk cleared his throat and read from a sheet with ribbon on it by authority of the territory of Colorado. And in concert with the federal government, the lands comprising Hartwell's tract and the adjoining valley are hereby designated the Hartwell Mustang Preserve. Stewardship and protection of said lands are conferred upon Elias Boone for services rendered and for proven trust. There was applause, awkward at first, and then solid. A few ranchers who had lost fence to the fire shouted their approval without irony. Abigail stood to the side, eyes bright with sleep-deprived pride, hands ink-stained even on a day of clean paper. Elias took the document. His hands shook not from fear, but from the unfamiliarity of receiving something that would not be taken away. He stepped to the front plank. He was not a speech man. When he spoke, it was to the point. I didn't save anything, he said quietly. I carried what a better man handed me, and I stood where a wild mother told me to stand. There was a ripple of laughter that wasn't unkind. The applause came again softer. The wind lifted and moved on. Spring did not arrive in a single day. It came in stitches. Black slopes showed stitches of green. Charred limbs put out thin leaves that looked too frail to hold even their own color. Wildflowers took the ash as a dare. In the bottoms where water had laid its hand, grass rose lush as if trying to make up for what the hilltops had lost. Elias rode the ridges with a steady seat and a new way of seeing. He'd always watched for weather for sign for trouble. Now he watched for recovery. He marked where frogs returned to a pool by counting the ripples at dusk. He noted where a willow sent up a red switch and fenced it with deadfall to give it a chance. He walked stretches instead of riding them, picking up the wire and nails that the fire had bared, leaving the ground clean and the mind less so. People came back as people will. A woman with a baby strapped to her chest planted beans in a yard where the fence posts were still char. A boy hammered a gate that hung straight, even though the house behind it leaned. Elias helped when help could be given with a hammer or a shoulder. When thanks were offered, he said they were owed to Hartwell. When blank looks followed, he pointed to the ridge and said, "Up there." One evening, with the sun rolling toward the far line and the light gone honey thick, a sound reached him that he had learned not just to hear, but to expect the solid, joyous drum of hooves on new grass. He reined in on a high meadow. The Mustang mare came out of the far cottonwoods at a brisk lope mane blowing hide, glossy as black water. 3 young, long-legged and certain ran with her in an easy echelon. They flowed more than galloped. They were the same animals who had shivered in his doorway, and they were not the same at all. Elias sat his horse and forgot to breathe for a moment. The mare saw him, checked her speed, and lifted her head. The old wary hardness was gone from her eyes, not trust exactly, but the cool acknowledgement given from one sovereign to another. He took off his hat and bowed it, not in jest. "Evening to you, ma'am," he said. "You kept your promise." She answered with a thin, sharp whicker that meant nothing to a dictionary and everything to the man who heard it. She turned and ran again, the young beside her, dust rising like incense in the level light. They crossed the meadow as if the land had been made to show them off. And perhaps it had. Elias dismounted at the crest and sat on the warm slope. He laid Hartwell's notebook on his knee, the little leather book that had seen more truth than most Bibles, and slid a hand over its cover. Somewhere below, water fussed among stones. Somewhere above, a hawk tested a new current and found it held. He let the past come because it wanted to, and because in this light it could not hurt him the same way. War smoke pulled thin and the grave stopped shouting. The cabins burning settled into a story that would be told, and then told again, until it was owned by more than one man. He had not planned any of it. He had only decided not to run. Sometimes he thought that is all the plan you get. The wind came up from the valley and brought the smell of green and the faint iron tang that means rain somewhere that matters. Elias smiled without noticing. The line of his mouth had learned the shape again. From the meadow, the mare wheeled once more, as if to be sure he was watching, and then vanished with her young into the trees. The grass where they had passed kept moving a while after they were gone, laying itself back down like a page turned and smoothed. Elias Boone sat with the light on his hands and the book across his knee, and understood that the thing he had lost beyond words had come back to him in a form he could hold. Not wealth, not safety. Something quieter, purpose, with the gentle weight of duty and the hard edge of a vow that does not break when shouted at. He would keep the ridge. He would keep the paperwork and the saplings and the streams. He would keep the story straight when men began to bend it. He would keep watch with the mare when she came to edge of the clearing at dusk and looked into the dark to see if what needed guarding that night came on 2 legs or 4. Down valley, a bell rang in a yard where a woman called her children home from play. Up slope, a fox slid between boulders like a flame turned small. The day leaned into its last color. When the first star came out, Elias tipped his head to it, like a man saluting a flag. And then he rose, swung into the saddle, and rode the fence line of a place that felt for the first time like it belonged not to him, but to the thing in him he had almost thrown away. Behind him, the Mustang's call carried once across the fresh grass, clear and clean as a promise kept. 20 years had passed since the night the mountains burned and the truth came out of ash and blood. The world beyond the Rockies had changed. Railroads had stretched their iron veins farther west. Towns had swelled into cities, and newspapers now crossed the continent in a day. But in the Hartwell Valley, time moved differently. Seasons were still measured by the thaw of rivers and the turning of grass, by the foaling of mares and the migrations of elk. Elias Boone was no longer the rangy, middle-aged drifter who had once stumbled into a cabin sold for 7 cents. Age had bent him, whitening his beard, silvering his hair, and slowing his stride. His back carried the stiffness of old campaigns, his hands bore the callous of reins and rifles, and his breath sometimes came short after a climb. Yet his eyes, still sharp, still steady, had not dimmed. The cabin had endured with him. Once charred and splintered, it had been rebuilt, strengthened with pine beams and stone hearth. A hand-painted sign above the porch now read, "Mustang Station, Hartwell Preserve." What had been a lonely refuge was now a ranger's post, a gathering place for herders, and a marker for those who passed through the high country. Around it stretched a valley reborn. The scars of fire had softened into meadows, and the forest stood tall and green again. And the stream that once shimmered faintly under smoke now ran clear and cold. Herds of wild horses grazed in the open, their coats flashing like coins in the sun, their hooves echoing freedom across the ridges. Elias lived in rhythms as simple as breath. Each dawn he saddled the one companion left from younger years, an old bay gelding whose muzzle had gone gray, and rode the patrol trails that crisscrossed the preserve. He checked fences where ranchers' stock might wander, guided travelers who strayed too close to the Mustang bands, and paused often to watch the horizon where storms gathered. The valley folk had long since given him a name. Children, spotting him on horseback against the skyline, shouted it as if it were a spell, the horse watcher. Adults used it with more reverence, and sometimes with a smile, as though the title had been carved into stone rather than passed from mouth to mouth. When Elias returned to the station, children from the outlying farms sometimes followed, perching on the steps, while he sat on the porch with his pipe. They begged for stories, and he gave them a few. Not of himself, not of glory, but of horses and rivers and the mountains' moods. He never called himself a hero. He never called the night of fire a victory. His tales were short, his words plain. What he said mattered less than the gravity of his voice, the sense that he had been tested and had endured. At night, when the lamps were low, Elias wrote in a tattered notebook, bound with cracked leather, the same Hartwell journal that had once borne the record of mines and corruption. Its margins were filled now with patrol notes, sketches of horses, and fragments of thought. He treated it not as an artifact, but as a companion. In the quiet of evenings, Elias often sat on the porch and let memory move through him. The sun dipping behind the ridge painted the sky in copper and violet, and in that light, the past sometimes walked close. He remembered Samuel Hartwell, frail, secretive, carrying more truth than his heart could withstand. He remembered Abigail Reeves, sharp-eyed and fearless, her hands ink-stained as she turned Hartwell's files into thunder on the front page. He remembered Clara and the boy long gone, whose absence had once hollowed him out so thoroughly he had thought himself nothing but an echo. Time had softened grief into something quieter. The raw wound had scarred, the scar no longer bled. He had come to understand that what he gained in the fire's wake was not triumph, but purpose. A man who had once drifted without tether now knew why he woke each day. To stand guard, to bear witness, to remain when it would have been easier to leave. Sometimes, when dusk was heavy, he thought he could still hear the crack of rifles, the scream of timber, the wild, defiant cry of the black mare as she hurled herself into battle beside him. Those sounds no longer haunted him. They reminded him that courage could live in both men and beasts, and that it had saved them all. The preserve thrived. Where once 3 trembling foals had hidden in the shadow of their mother, now hundreds of Mustangs thundered across the plains. The herds broke into bands, each led by stallions, proud and fierce, yet always returning to graze together in the lush valleys. The black mare, once the sentinel of his doorway, had grown into a matriarch. Her coat, though streaked now with gray, still gleamed, and her presence commanded respect. She moved less swiftly, but when she did, the younger horses followed without question. The foals she had shielded long ago had become leaders in their own right when a muscled stallion who drove his band across the high ridges, another a sleek mare whose speed was legend among ranch boys, and the third a cautious but clever leader of a group that never lost a foal to predators. Elias watched them from the saddle or the porch and felt a smile crease his weathered face. They were proof more eloquent than any words that life had outlasted death. How that flame and bullet had not claimed the last word. Each hoofbeat said we survived, and more we flourished. When the black mare lifted her head and caught his eye across the grass, he tipped his hat as he had on that first spring when she had accepted him. It was a greeting between equals, between guardians of different kind. In nearby towns, men and women spoke often of the legend of the 7-cent cabin. It was told in saloons whispered to newcomers and printed in the Gazette whenever anniversaries returned. Children played at being Elias Boone, crouching behind imaginary barricades, or pretended to be the black Mustang charging a line of invisible soldiers. The story always had three pillars: Hartwell, the martyr who had died for the truth; Abigail Reeves, the voice who had turned that truth loose upon the world; and Elias Boone, the drifter who had chosen to stand rather than flee. Each retelling polished the tale, making it brighter, grander, sometimes less real. But the essence held one man, one mare, and a cabin against the machine of greed. When asked, Elias chuckled softly and said, "Only, I did what anyone should do when the time comes, not run." He did not argue with the legend, but neither did he live by it. The valley, the horses, and the children who laughed outside his porch mattered more than the stories men told. Still, when he walked into town on supply days, ranchers tipped hats and mothers called their children to see him. To them, he was no longer a drifter. He was the watcher, the man who had kept the valley alive. One evening, when spring was folding toward summer and the meadows shimmered with green, Elias sat on his porch with Hartwell's notebook balanced on his knee. The sun bled gold across the ridges, turning dust into fireflies in the air. The black mare and her band thundered across the plain below their manes, streaming their cries, lifting into the sky like banners of sound. Elias leaned back, eyes half closed, and let the sight soak through him. He no longer saw foals trembling in smoke, but strong horses running free. He no longer felt the sting of loss, but the calm of having found what he had sought unknowingly all along. The notebook, worn and patched, lay open to a blank page. Elias pressed his hand flat across it, not to write, but to feel the weight of years. Hartwell's hand had started it. His own had carried it forward. Soon, it would pass again, perhaps to one of the children, who crowded his steps, perhaps to another hand not yet born. The wind shifted, carrying the Mustang's cries up the slope. Elias closed his eyes, smiling as the sound wrapped him like an old blanket. He thought of Clara, of his boy, of Hartwell, of Abigail, who had braved the press-room storms, and of the black mare who had once barred his way, and then chosen to stand beside him. He breathed out slowly. The valley answered with silence, with wind, with the steady pulse of the hooves far below. In that moment, Elias Boone was no longer a wanderer or even a guardian. He was part of the mountain of the grass of the herd of the legend that would outlive all of them. And when twilight laid its hand over the Hartwell Valley, the watcher of the horses smiled once more, content as the world folded into quiet and carried his memory forward with the echo of hooves and the whisper of the wind.